Not everything has to be a full-fledged, crazy, beautiful, well put together experience. I think there's still value in very organic, small, random acts of events. And there are ways to feasibly pull off a event strategy that might not look the way that people generally think of an event strategy.
Every B2B marketing team faces challenges when they have to do more with less. Should you build skills internally? Should you find a freelancer? Should you search for the right agency? This is Tech Qualified, a podcast for the scrappy B2B marketing teams. In each episode, Meredith Metsker, a senior content leader at a tech company, and Justin Brown, a marketing agency owner, uncover how marketing teams generate qualified opportunities with limited resources. Every episode helps you get one step closer to winning over your ideal customers.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Tech Qualified. I'm your host, Meredith Metsker. This show is brought to you by New North. New North specializes in working with B2B marketers who have to do more with less. When you partner with New North, you turn your small, scrappy marketing team into a growth engine. I am super excited to welcome our guest today, Lindsay McGuire. Lindsay is the Associate Director of Content and Campaigns at Goldcast. Thank you for being here, Lindsay.
Yeah, so excited to be here. Pumped.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out how long we've known each other, like at least a few years now, I think.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I want to say at least 2, if not 3 years. So it's been a hot minute.
Yeah, it's been fun getting to know you on LinkedIn and kind of following along as we both transitioned jobs, taken on leadership roles, and tried to work our magic in the ever-changing world of content marketing. And kind of on that note, I'm so excited to have you on the show today to talk about how to design an event strategy for a small marketing team. I know this is a hot topic for a lot of small B2B marketing teams as we navigate shrinking budgets, limited resources, but of course, we're still expected to produce the big results, right?
Always.
So to kick us off, Lindsay, can you just talk to me a little bit about how you think about an event strategy? Like, what's your first step?
Yeah, I think it definitely depends what you want to get out of that event strategy, right? There's lots of reasons why you would want to do live virtual events or large scale conferences and summits or whatever type of event you're putting on, or even in-person field events. So it honestly really starts with what's your goal, what's your KPI that you're trying to go after, what's your end result you're looking for. I think for us, we think of events in probably 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different ways because we are an event-led company. We are also a virtual event platform that also can handle some of those in-person field event features as well. But for us, it's really thinking about how can we use events strategically to do a lot of the different kind of various outcomes we're looking for as a business. How do we use events to fuel our community strategy? How do we use events to build our brand? How do we use events to pull in a new demographic or a new audience or a new industry? And also, how do we use those events to not only, fuel our pipeline, fuel our sales, but also how do we use it strategically alongside our customers for renewals, for expansions? So there's a lot of areas you can go into. And what's the most fun and best thing about events, I think, is because there's so much diversity and you can cover a lot of ground with them. And you don't need a whole huge arsenal of people, generally speaking, to do it either.
Right. Yeah, there's so many different types of events and so many reasons, as you said, that you might want to start an event strategy. So it sounds like your first step is kind of just figuring out the why behind why you might want to do it.
Yeah. So for us, with the show that I host, our virtual event series, we do live on the second Tuesday of every month. It's called Donuts in Demand. And that event strategy is really based upon wanting to attract a new audience that we haven't necessarily heavily marketed to in the past. So as a virtual and in-person events platform, we've really obviously focused on event marketers and field marketers. And that's been really our bread and butter audience for the first 3 years of our company's existence. And in the last year, we started realizing that more and more events are also playing a big role in the demand generation space. So we realized, okay, we need to start really honing in on this audience and bringing these people into the fold of our brand, of our product, of our organization. And so that is kind of what led us to then invest in the Donuts and Demand strategy we're running, which is a live virtual event we run monthly. And one thing that was nice is we've actually done 2 ongoing live event series in the past. We ran CMO Diaries for about 2 years. We sunsetted that in May to then make room for Donuts and Demand coming in September is when we launched with that show. And then Event Marketers Live is our show focused solely on those event and field marketers. And I want to say it is celebrating 2 years in February. So it's really cool to see how these have started and just kept going and growing and adapting as we've needed to use them for different sources.
Yeah, that's great. It's been fun to watch kind of your journey with Donuts and Demand and then some of the other events that Goldcast does. So it's fun to watch that from the outside. And curious, what do you think small marketing teams should keep in mind as they consider building an event strategy?
Yeah, what's funny is I actually just had a conversation with John from Everlaw. He's working on a new event series. And he approached me just kind of wondering, like, how many people do I need to have on hand to run an ongoing event series? And, how many people do I need to handle the logistics and the functioning and things like that? Of course, it's going to vary from org to org and just how you're structured, what resources, budgets, those kind of things you have. But in all honesty, it doesn't take a massive team. First and foremost, you need a host because that's important for some kind of live event or show or podcast or whatever kind of function you're running as that series or, event series. So you'll need a host, someone to be like the face and the brand of that. And also, I think it's a misconception that you just need one person. There are ways to create an event series and have multiple hosts. So it doesn't necessarily mean that one person is taking on this whole entire series. That can be your strategy, but there are also ways to integrate it across people, maybe fluctuating across 2 people, maybe having 4 that split it up across the year. Lots of opportunity and flexibility there, I would say. So first and foremost, whoever your show host is or event series host, however you want to position it, or hosts. Then also it's important to have a producer. So the producer is going to handle a lot of the day of logistics. They're the one who's going to make sure everything is running smoothly the day of your event. So the host can focus solely on being a great host. Because if you're trying to split between being like the producer and the showrunner and the host, you're going to eventually get off track, right? Something is going to distract you. Something's going to pull you away. And that's the last thing you want as the person who's facilitating that event. So I say those are 2 really important roles. And then as far as like the logistics and back end, a lot of the time what is helpful is to have your host be the person who is also doing the marketing of the show, doing the copywriting for the show. So for instance, Donuts and Demand, I'm not only the host, but I also am writing all the email marketing we're doing. I'm writing all the landing page copy. I'm doing all the other campaign and ad sourcing that we're doing. So being able to cross-collaborate, cross-pollinate with that role is super helpful. And then it is nice that I do have an ops person who helps me with facilitating our HubSpot email sends, building out our Goldcast events from month to month. But you might not necessarily need that person, especially for the kind of logistical event setup side. I theoretically can go into Goldcast and set up the whole entire event on my own. Again, it depends how intuitive your tool is, how difficult it is to set up and get going, and the time investment. But if I didn't have Ananya, who's our ops queen, I really could do that myself and facilitate that. And then the only other piece I would say is having someone who can handle the branding, the visuals, the graphics. I'm a content marketer, but I am not a graphic designer by any...
Same.
Oh God, that's my nightmare. So I would say also having someone who can handle the branding, the design, that piece of it. For our show, we have one person who does all the design work as far as like social media, email graphics, things like that. And we have a video producer who helps do our video ads and our video campaigns. And when I say video in this instance, it's talking about like graphically animated videos. As far as videos on like the post-production side of like once my event's done and creating those, I actually create them all in Content Lab myself, which is a game changer. So I would say that's overall 4 people. Is it 4? Did I count right? 4 or 5? So
yeah, 4 or 5.
again,
Yeah.
There are ways to like cut that down if you need to and if it's necessary.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting. It can take a team. And I was like nodding my head along when you were talking about the need for a producer and how it's helpful as a host to have a producer. Because I have been in situations where I am both. Like I am the showrunner, I am the host, I am the producer, I am the editor, even. And it's a lot.
Yes, for sure. And so that is one thing I always advocate for anyone who's running events is, no matter how short-staffed and small of a team you are, just try to find someone who can play that showrunner and producer role, because that is really crucial to the successfulness of your content. Because if your host or moderator can really focus in on exactly what they are meant to deliver upon, that's just going to up-level your content that much more. But if they're having to juggle, moderating the chat and running the Q&A and, pushing, if any technical things hop up and they have to do something, like it just makes it that much more stressful. And anyone who's done live events, there's a whole other level of stress that comes with that, just innately from the nature of the beast, we'll say. But if you can have kind of your control person in their little flight, not deck, what is it called? Flight tower. I mean, that will like change your experience as a live event producer, as a live event host. So if, you're a one person marketing team, you're like, but I got no one, find someone, find like a CSM, find, someone in sales, like get someone else involved to help support you with that, because it really will change your ability of what you're able to produce with that live event.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask like what your advice would be for maybe teams of like 2 or 3 who are very, very small, very scrappy. Like what should they do in terms of events?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's actually something that we focused on in our series masterclass. So that was a 4-part series we ran just in this last month or so. And it was all about how to create, launch, and maintain an ongoing event series. And in our first live session, we actually did 2 segments. And the second segment was all about how live events should not just be owned by marketing. They should not just be run by marketing. I think that's a big miss by a lot of organizations, that they just hone this in solely to the marketing team. But yet there's so much talent, there's so much great content, there's so many opportunities outside of that if you get other teams involved. So I always highly advocate, see how to get sales involved, see how to get CSMs involved, see how to get product involved. There's so many opportunities to develop better content by pairing up with those teams, or even having those teams run their own series and then come to marketing as like a subject matter expert or as an assistant or a reviewer or whatever kind of way you want to facilitate that. But we ran a whole entire episode and had showrunners, show developers, show hosts on who do not work in marketing to talk about exactly the worth of doing that and how they make that function, especially because I think there's just such an assumption that, if you're running live events or you're doing some kind of series, it has to be marketing. Like, that's not true, and it shouldn't be true, right? Like, there's just so much talent outside the walls of marketing. So just figuring out what's the capacity, what's the opportunity, how does it integrate into your business, and how do you make that work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's just so many other great perspectives within a company outside of marketing.
Yeah, some of our best content that we've done has come from bridging across our departments. So if there are ways for you to do it and do it in a way that's efficient, makes sense, do it 100%.
There you go. Yeah, your host doesn't have to be a marketer. Like you could find a host on your sales team, CS team, product team, as you were saying.
1,000,000% yes.
Okay. I'm curious, how do you think through like virtual versus in-person events? Like how do you decide what is the best play?
Yeah, that is a great question. The first thing that always pops into my head when dictating what deserves to go where or making those decisions between that is first budget, right? Like you don't need a lot of money necessarily to run a virtual event because you're not paying costs that you generally would pay for an in-person event. If you're doing an in-person event, you have to think about things like, how much do I have to pay for an event space? Is there a parking cost? Are we going to provide food? Are we going to provide drinks? Like, is there swag or some kind of items? Like, there's just a lot more costs that go into an in-person event. So that's the number one thing that pops into my head of like, how do I differentiate between those? How do I make my decisions there? But I also think it depends too on, again, like I started the conversation, your KPIs, what are you trying to do? And what experience are you trying to provide people? As great as virtual events are, because they open up accessibility, they make it very easy. Generally speaking, they're a lot more accessible because you don't have to travel anywhere. You don't have to pay anything. You don't have to book in the time to like go 30 minutes downtown or whatever it might be. There's also like a differentiation of the experience, right? There's just some things you're going to get in person that you honestly like can't really get or capture the same way virtually. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And I would say, this might sound a little weird how I'm going to say this, but stick with me. The value of the audience and the value of the people you're trying to bring in the room. So again, if it's coming down to you're really trying to drive sales or pipeline or renewals or things like that, that's when in person is really great, because you are curating those relationships. You're building that, interaction face to face. And there's just something different. We can all agree there's something different when you get to see someone in person versus like on a computer screen in my office with my dogs behind me, So I think that's also something to keep in mind, is just I don't know a good kosher way to say it that doesn't sound kind of weird and like icky, but it depends on the level of investment you want to put into it too, right? And not saying that like virtual events obviously work and they work well. But again, if there is a certain level of urgency or importance, then that might weigh you in the side of in person. But it also depends on where people are, right? Like if that audience is really dispersed and you don't have a big amount of people in one space, then that might even skew back to virtual, right? So there's just like a lot to think about, really.
Yeah. It was making me think back to your comment about like needing a team, even for virtual events. Like you probably need an even larger team for in-person events.
Yeah. In person definitely gets a lot heavier on the people power you need, and even the logistical planning too, especially if I think with in-person events, there's a whole nother level of expectation, right? Because you are not only giving away your time, but you're probably traveling, you're probably putting some sort of amount of money into that experience. Like you as an attendee going, either you paid for it or, you're spending gas money to get there, et cetera, et cetera. You got real paints on. I mean, who does that anymore? So I think there's like a whole nother level of expectation in people's minds when they are making the investment to go to in person. And so that means like you really have to deliver on that event. So again, that means you have to have your parking figured out. You have to have all your timing figured out, especially if you're doing larger scale events. And if they're multi-day, like that is just a whole nother extravaganza. And, planning meals and knowing about dietary restrictions and being able to provide guests all the information they need. Here are the bathrooms, here are the nursing rooms, here is, where you can go to work if you need to work during the event. Like there's just a whole nother level of logistics you need to plan. That takes a whole nother level of manpower. Not to mention too, if you're shipping items and bringing in swag, and if you're doing any kind of like conference or something and you need to bring iPads or any kind of like registration materials and booths, and it's just a whole nother level of, oh wow, that's a list to go through. Yeah. And it's worthwhile, but you have to be sure you're investing it in the right places, right times, right audiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's definitely something like for a small team, especially to really consider as they think about their event strategy.
And I think you have to also think about the fact that not everything has to be a full-fledged, crazy, beautiful, well put together experience. I think there's still value in very organic, small, random acts of events, like, a small coffee meetup or just like, let's all go to lunch. And there are ways to feasibly pull off a event strategy that might not look the way that people generally think of an event strategy. I think when people think events, they usually think like really, really highly curated experiences, probably an expensive line item, but there are ways to balance that out with more organic, low level, low scale, low lift events as well. For instance, one thing we've done is we have a community called the Event Marketers Club. And we have like city chapter leaders who essentially help us be able to do these smaller, more personal events in the different locations. And so one way that we have done kind of these more organic, lower level, lower lift events is just have those city chapter leaders, talk to members, get a group of 5, 10, 15, and just like go to coffee or go grab lunch. And, you do spend a little bit in that because we're covering the coffee or covering the lunch, but usually you're going somewhere where you don't have to pay to rent the room. It's very organic. It's usually sourced across members, so they agree on a place that is convenient for everybody and kind of splits the bill in that way. So I think there are ways to have an event strategy where you're not spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, because some of those bigger events are literally $60,000 to show up and play ball. So
Yeah, that's a really great point. Like I see a lot of like digital communities do like regular AMAs or fireside chat, things like that, where they're still events, but they are much more low key, as you were saying.
yeah, and having
And still
diversity,
effective.
yes, having diversity is the best way to go for sure.
There you go. Yep. Diversify that portfolio, as it were.
Oh, now we sound like financial analysts.
I know. So, Lindsay, if let's say, like hypothetically, if you were advising a small marketing team or you were leading like a really small marketing team, how would you approach designing an events strategy?
Oh, that's a good question. Again, I think it all begins and starts with what are the goals of your org, right? What are your top level goals? What are your departmental goals? What are you trying to hit? And I'm always an advocate too of balancing between those kind of like more sales heavy pipeline goals and revenue goals with the goals of like brand building, demand gen, community. Because if you focus on just one and not the other, you're never going to be fully successful, right? It's just you're going to skew yourself and you're going to miss out on opportunities. So I think it's figuring out what are your top level goals, what are your departmental goals, and then figuring out the best balance between those very much like bottom of funnel, sales focus levers and go to market strategies, but also mixing in those branded opportunities, more of the demand gen side of it, being sure there's a balance there. And again, it depends on your budget, what's going to work best for you and what you're able to do. Definitely for smaller teams that likely have smaller budgets, I would say don't even be thinking about those huge conferences and those big giant events, because it's going to eat up a lot of your budget. Like your money is going to go like that in 2 seconds. It's actually quite crazy sometimes when you dive into those line item budgets of how much you have to pay just to have a booth at an event or just to have a presence at a conference. So again, I think it also depends on your budget, how much money you're putting into this. And then as far as kind of building that strategy, again, like we just kind of joked about, diversify your portfolio, right? Especially if you're just starting to get into events, test things, right? Like test doing a monthly live demo, test doing a recorded demo that could even qualify as an event, test out doing maybe a 4-part series that's a live event series, test out maybe starting an ongoing series that's either monthly or quarterly or even bi-weekly. If you want to do something bigger and flashier, one thing Qualified does is they do their Pipeline Summit, which is a big summit they put on virtually. I want to say they do it quarterly, but don't quote me on that. But I think there's different things you can test, you can try out. And then the best thing with live events, especially if you're using a platform like Goldcast, you can literally ask your audience in the moment, what do you want more of? What do you want less of? You can kind of gather data through polls, through Q&A, through resource clicks, and you can then use that live audience feedback to then develop your strategy more. So you're not just shooting in the dark. You're not just throwing spaghetti at the wall. You're not just like guesstimating or doing a bunch of like keyword research to figure out what you should do. You're actually able to interact with your audience live and with your target demographics, your target audience, and figure out exactly what they want. So then you can then use that data to refine your strategy alongside whatever the results of those events, whatever your goals are. So it kind of all intertwines together.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really great kind of like list of things to consider, list of places to start. I'm curious, like let's another kind of hypothetical here. let's say that someone is a little skeptical or maybe afraid of starting an event strategy because of the budget, because of the work required. What would you say to them to try to convince them that it's worthwhile?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question too. I would say, and I'll approach from like the virtual side and then the in-person side. The virtual side, I'd say there's not a lot to lose, right? Like, if anything, you will see benefits versus any losses or any painful moments or things not working out. Because as long as you are doing the research to know what's going to attract your audience and what they want and need, if you produce that and give it to them, you're just going to reap benefits from it. And again, if you use a platform where you're able to interact with your audience, you're able to give them opportunities to tell you what they're looking for or ask questions or get involved in your content. I mean, you're just going to get benefits out of that, right? You'll get benefits. Your audience will get benefits. It'll build brand affinity. It'll build trust. It'll build you as a thought leadership or a thought leader. So there's really not a lot to lose. Yes, there probably needs to be an investment there, especially if you want to find a virtual event platform that will enable you to have those interactions, have those moments. There's going to be a line item cost there, right? And you also have to equate the time of the people who are running that event strategy, that event series, or whatever those events are. But again, it's just a way to get yourself in front of the right people, engage them in real time in a way that you can't really do in a lot of ways, right? And so that's kind of my positioning, I think, on that virtual side of it. And also the added bonus there too is I think a lot of people, when they think event strategy, do not connect it into content strategy. But that is such a miss, because honestly, so much of our content strategy is anchored in our event strategy. Because think about it. For Donuts in Demand, I'm getting 2 leaders in demand generation on a live event for an hour. I'm able to ask them very specific questions. The audience is able to ask them questions. We're able to pull out so much content from that. And a lot of times they'll come with images or decks or really like cool frameworks and playbooks and things like that. And from just 1 hour of time from me and these 2 guests, I mean, I can crank out, if I wanted to, honestly, like hundreds of pieces of content, right? Because you have little video snippets. You can pull that stuff into blog posts, into guides, into infographics, into social media posts, like on and on and on. So I think that's another piece of it to think about is if you're looking for ways to fuel your content strategy and your content wheel, events is I don't want to say easiest because it's not really easy necessarily, but is one of the best ways to do that. And you really you're never out of content, right? Like I can take one, episode from our AI summit we ran in October, and I'm literally still parsing out content from that. And we ran it in October and it's now January. So think about that one, right? And then the in-person one, like I said earlier, there is just something special about doing in-person events and getting in front of people. Again, I think it's a little bit more of a risk sometimes, especially if you are trying to be very cautious with money and budget and people. But again, it's thinking about the value you're getting out of that. And so I think if you are just starting out and doing in-person kind of field-based events, I would say start with events that are catered to your customers, because that's probably going to yield the biggest ROI for you. Because if you're doing an in-person event somewhere and you're trying to get prospects in the door, it's probably a lot harder because they might not even know about you. They might not know what you do, what you're offering. It's so hard to capture that attention, even from like an online perspective. And then like getting them to physically go through a door, that's another like level of hardship, I would say. So if you are just starting out with in-person, I would highly recommend thinking about, can you do some like in-person client dinners, or can you do some in-person customer training? I know one thing I really liked is when I was a Terminus customer at my last organization, they did a really cool in-person customer only training sessions that lasted like 2 or 3 hours, super helpful content. I got to like meet other customers, collaborate with them. So I'd say if you're just starting out in person and trying to figure out what that strategy should be, the best place to start is probably focusing on your customers because they already know you. They probably, hopefully, like you and trust you. And so it's probably likely easier to get them to show up versus a net new prospect or someone who might not be familiar with your brand.
Okay. Yeah, that's some great advice, like really good advice. And it's a lot to think through, but it's definitely worth it. I completely agree. Like in my full-time job at UConnect, like we have our regular biweekly podcast as kind of an event of sorts that fuels our content strategy. Like it is the pillar from which we pull articles, video clips, social media content, like the whole gamut. And not to mention like those benefits, but it's so beneficial for me as the content marketer to be having conversations with the target audience, several times a month. You cannot beat that kind of research.
No, because, the Google will lie to you and all the articles will spew whatever position and perspective they want to. But those people you're having those conversations with are going to be authentic. It's going to be real. It's going to be helpful for the most part. And so, yeah, you're so right. Like you can't, imagine if you were to have to pay to get that access. Essentially you're getting it for free. Yeah, you have to invest in whatever tech you're using to create those virtual moments. But beyond that, it is a wealth of knowledge and resources and forever going content, right? Like as Ross Simmons would say, create once, repurpose forever, right? Like there you go. Boom.
Yep. Good words to live by there, especially in the marketing world. Okay, so I'm curious, like let's say, a small team has decided they are going to invest in events. How would you recommend they start thinking through like topics, themes, format, that kind of thing?
I'm almost kicked of this cough. Almost. Yeah, I would say first and foremost, go to the data you have, right? So look at the campaigns you've run in the past. Look at the keywords you're going after. Look at your most popular content, whether that be videos or blog posts or even open rates on emails you've done in the past. Just look at what has resonated with your audience so far. Use that as a starting point. And I would say too, like ask people, right? So when we were in the beginnings of Donuts in Demand and we were really thinking about the show flow and the show name and the theme and things like that, I DM'd probably like 20 people and was like, hey, I would love to run this idea for our new show past you, get your feedback, get your thoughts, crowdsource some stuff. And you'd be amazed, like the willingness, especially like if you're a marketer, marketing to marketers, like that's definitely an easier route to go sometimes. So maybe not for all audiences and industries this will work, but ask your network, right? Like ask your target audience. If you have some customers who love your brand and love your org, reach out and ask them about their ideas and their thoughts about that. And even crowdsource from your customers and from your existing audience, do an email campaign to your email list that says, hey, we're going to be launching a new series or events or whatever it might be around XYZ topic or theme. What do you want to learn about? What do you want to hear about? Like, you might only have 5 people respond, but in those 5 people, you're probably going to have very legitimate ideas and you'll have 5 people that are going to show up and are interested and intrigued. So I would say do the research through your own data and through what you've seen as a brand working and an organization working. Talk to your customers, talk to your audience, talk to who is your target audience. And also too, like mine things internally, right? Especially if it's something that does relate to your product or service or what you're selling. Talk to your sales team, talk to your CSMs, talk to your product team, depending on kind of what the pitch or the idea is, because they probably have a wealth of knowledge too, and can then bring further perspectives, further ideas that you might not ever even consider into the gamut. So I think it's kind of those 3 kind of points in the triangle of talk to your customers and or target audience, talk to people in your network that you have connections and relationships with, and then talk to your people internally too. That's the best way to kind of like get those ideas flowing, get things figured out. And I would say the more you can cross collab in the early days, the better, because the more ideas at that point, the better off you are, because you can kind of get a whole kind of scheme of things and then whittle it down from there.
Yeah, that's really solid advice. I think I might add like one more thing, which is to kind of look for gaps in your industry. Like what is everybody else doing? What are they not doing? And what can we add? And maybe what can we do better than what already exists? Like, I know that's something we did when, again, at UConnect, when we were thinking about starting a podcast, we were looking around in the industry, like, there are not that many podcasts or video series or things like that in this industry. We think that we can add something here. We think we can do better than maybe some of the other ones that exist.
Oh, yes, that is crucial, because the last thing you want to do is just add the same kind of BS into the ecosystem that already exists, right? Like, we're already so over inundated with content and shows and series and noise and all the things, and we're all trying to capture people's attention. And so if you're replicating something that already exists, then yeah, you're already like losing the race, right?
Yeah, at that point, like, if you're not going to do it better, then, you may as well just not do it.
It is the truth.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, sometimes part of an event strategy is deciding when not to do an event.
Yeah, or even when to sunset, right? Like, that was something that came up on our series masterclass in episode 4. We had Logan from Yext, Travis from PandaDoc, who's now at Motion, and Belinda, our head of events and community. And that was one topic that our audience brought forth that we talked about is, well, when do you know it's time to sunset a series and it's not worth producing anymore or going forward anymore? So it's a really interesting piece to think about too.
Yeah. I'm curious, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that goes into that. Of course, if your business has changed and the series you're running does not align with that business anymore, that's definitely a huge thing to think about. If your audience has shifted or you need to shift who you're focusing on, that might play a role into it. For instance, with CMO Diaries, when we sunsetted that show, it kind of was a combination of we needed to go after a new audience. So it was no longer a huge focus on those CMOs. It was focusing now on those demand generation marketers. So shifting to a new audience and also like capacity and time, right? So Kishore, who's our COO, he was the host for CMO Diaries. And it just was getting to the point where his workload on other things was just becoming so much that it was difficult for him to be able to execute all the things plus this show. And plus it had run for 2 years. So we had so much content from that series. And so at some point you probably get to a period where you're like, is this content really benefiting? And are we getting anything different anymore? So I think that's another thing that plays a role into kind of that sunsetting. And of course, too, I think sometimes shift in personnel, right? Like if you have a very strong show host and they leave, if you don't have a backup of someone else to fill in that slot, that also might be a good time to say, well, it was a good run, but time to shut the doors, close it on down. So there's a lot that factors into that. And I think, too, the obvious of, if your stats and your KPIs and your goals and the things you're getting out of the show are not aligning anymore, that's probably also a flag to rethink. And it doesn't always mean you have to sunset. It might be that you update something, you rebrand, you refresh it. So it's not always like, oh, now it's time to end, but there's a lot of things to weigh in that conversation.
Yep. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's an important part of an event strategy is not only when to start, but when to stop.
Yeah.
Everything can't always go on forever.
Yeah. And as marketers, I think it's really hard because, again, I think you even said this in your opening statement of we're expected to do more with less all the time, right? And we're expected just to crank out and crank out and crank out and put things out and put it out to market and do another campaign and do another event. And I think one big gap is not taking enough time to assess what we're doing and see if it's working and have those hard conversations about, well, is it really worthwhile to do this, in-person VIP dinner series again? Or is it really valuable to have this series going weekly or bi-weekly or whatever it might be? So there's some hard conversations to be had, but it's important to have them and be open and transparent when you have them.
Yeah, I could not agree more. So I kind of want to be mindful of our time here and just sort of start wrapping us up. But Lindsay, is there any other advice you have for small marketing teams who want to invest in events? Yeah, again, I think it's just staying true to what you want out of those events, right? What is the end goal? What is the end benefit?
And I think sometimes people think just baseline with events that it's all just about getting butts and seats, right? Of course, if you're doing an in-person like event, yes, that is very crucial because otherwise you're paying a lot of money and you're losing a lot of money. But when it comes to virtual events, it's not always, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, but it's not always about, growing your event to a massive registration list or ensuring that you have like this huge, attendance rate every time. Those things are important. And depending again on your goals and your outcomes and what you're wanting to get out of it, sometimes those are the stats you're going to go after. But I think there's another layer of events where, yes, I care about getting people to register for Donuts in Demand. I obviously care about getting them in that room live and having an audience during that actual conversation. But that's not the end of the story. Like, I'm also concerned about people coming back to that content for on-demand viewing and getting value out of it after the event. I also care about people seeing that content after the event, even if they haven't like gone to the event, even if they weren't either registered or an attendee, like being able to use that to further educate, further attract our audience. I think there's a lot to say about the value of events past just getting registrants and getting attendees, and the value that a live virtual event series can bring to your media strategy. And that's one thing that's been so cool about coming to Goldcast is that I'm able to power so much of our content through just having events. And it's not just like I run it and it's done and it fell off the mountainside and I'm never going to see it again, right? Like I said, like I'm still using content from our AI summit, and that happened, like 4 or 5 months ago. So there's so much value in just having this be a part of your go-to-market function. And it doesn't have to be that you put on, 40, 50 events a year. You could even do simply like a monthly live event one time a month. That's 12 episodes for a year. But then think about how much content then you can pull out of that. So I think it's the biggest thing for me is just being able to see events past just it being an event, right? It's so much more than an event. And especially if you have a tool like our content lab where you can come in, you can automatically clip videos, you can automatically produce like emails and blogs and outlines and social media postings. Just think about how that can scale you and how that can really like make you as a small marketing team look so much bigger than you are, right? Like you could only have 2 or 3 marketers, but with the right tools and the right approach and the right strategy, you might look like a team of like 30 or 40. Like it's possible, trust me, because I think a lot of people think Goldcast is a lot bigger than we are too. So I can bring the perspective of, there are ways to make it look like you're a much bigger, bolder brand than you are. If you want an example of that in real life, our first episode of our series masterclass, Mara and Ian Mara from Qualified, Ian from Caspian Studios joined us. And Mara talked about how the reason they started their podcast was to make their brand look so much bigger than it was. And they didn't have a massive team producing it. And yet being able to have the right strategy and the right guests really propelled them and just magnified their brand in ways that they wouldn't be able to do with other content sources. So it was a really cool story, I think, that resonates with this audience of kind of a smaller team, a smaller marketing group.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think back to when Uconnect hosted an in-person event in Boston last year. And my boss and I were talking to one of the attendees who knows the company pretty well. And we said, if you had to guess, based on everything that you've seen from Uconnect, how big do you think our marketing team is? And I think they said like 10 people. And we just started laughing because it was 2 of us.
Mm-hmm.
We're like, with the right plays, you can have a outsized impact for sure.
Yes, and being smart too about your time and resources. I know one thing that you all did that I thought was really cool, and I don't know if it was that event or a different event, but you hosted some kind of in-person event, and then you did customer interviews in a hotel room with like a pop-up banner. And I was like, that's genius. That's so genius. And like, I think we need to be thinking more about, how do you maximize all the opportunities you have? And like an example of doing that in a virtual kind of experience is we did a kind of like product Q&A about our content lab that was open to the public. And some of the people who were interactive in the chat, I was like watching the event. I was like, you know what? This is a prime time to like DM these people, capture these quotes, see if I can get any more content out of what's happening during this live event. So just getting creative about all the opportunities you have during these like really precious moments you're creating.
This is like a full circle moment, but it reminds me back at the beginning, which we were talking about needing a producer or someone to manage the chat in those events for this exact reason. You never know when the gold quote might come up.
Yes, it's so true. And trying to like capture things as they're going down. And like, yes, exactly. That's why you need a little extra hands on deck.
All right. Well, Lindsay, is there anything else you would like to add that we haven't covered?
I think the last thing is that if you want to chat about virtual events, in-person events, talking about becoming a better host or how to run, virtual events from a logistics side or a management side, I'm an open book. I'm always happy to chat about these topics. So feel free to reach out to me. Go find me on LinkedIn, Lindsay McGuire. Yep, it's like Lindsay McGuire. Don't be thrown off when you see my maiden name. I just never adjusted my LinkedIn, which I don't know if that's a bad thing or a good thing or a bar none thing, but I'm Lindsay Latteru on LinkedIn. So feel free to connect with me. I'm always happy to chat, talk about what we're doing at Goldcast to run our ongoing series and our live events.
Perfect. Yeah, I highly recommend everyone listening to reach out to Lindsay. She is awesome and her content is great on LinkedIn. So you will not regret that.
What an endorsement.
Cool.
I love it.
Awesome. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for taking the time to join me on Tech Qualified today. This was a really fun conversation, and I think our audience will get a lot of value from it as they think about their event strategy. So just thank you again.
Well, thank you. And hopefully everyone found it super helpful, super relevant. And hopefully everyone stays well, too, because the sickness is abound, and it's crazy right now. So
it 'tis the season, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again, Lindsay, and have a great rest of your week.
Bye. Thanks, you too.
Thanks for checking out Tech Qualified. This show is brought to you by New North, a marketing agency that helps turn your small, scrappy marketing team into a growth engine. To find out more about New North or check out more episodes of this show, go to newnorth.com/techqualified.